The winter of 1887 came down on the Dakota Plains like a hammer. It was not a gentle arrival, not a slow dusting of snow that promised cozy nights by the fire. It was a declaration of war from the sky, a sudden and brutal siege. The cold did not knock before it entered. It broke down the door. It seeped through the thickest logs, found the smallest chinks in the mud daubing, and crept across the floors like a thief in the night. It was a living thing, a predator that hunted warmth with a relentless, patient hunger. For the settlers in the small, unnamed township clinging to the edge of Willow Creek, survival was measured in cords of wood and the thickness of a wool blanket. In a cabin no different from the 24 others that dotted the landscape, Ilara listened to the sound of her children coughing. It was a dry, brittle sound that seemed to echo the scraping of bare branches against the roof. Her son, Thomas, was 6, and her daughter, Lily, was 4. Their faces, even in sleep, were pale and pinched. She could see their breath misting in the air, a constant, visible reminder of the cold that had taken up residence inside their home. Their cabin, built with the same techniques as every other, was a fortress with failing walls. The fire in the stone hearth was a ravenous beast, devouring oak and ash with a desperate roar. Yet its heat seemed to travel no more than 5 feet before the cold pounced on it and extinguished its power. Ilara would sit up through the long nights, feeding the fire, watching the frost creep inward from the window panes, painting ghostly ferns on the glass. The walls themselves felt cold to the touch, a deep, penetrating chill that radiated into the room. A draft, thin and sharp as a knife, sliced through the space between the floorboards. She had stuffed the cracks with rags, with dried moss, with everything she could think of, but the cold always found a new way in. It was an enemy of infinite patience and endless invention. She was losing the battle, and the sound of her children's coughing was the sound of her defeat. This struggle was not hers alone. It was the shared reality of the entire settlement. In the mornings, men would emerge from their cabins with shoulders hunched, their faces grim. They spoke of the endless wood chopping, of fires that burned through a week's supply in 2 days. They complained of frozen water buckets just feet from the hearth, of the livestock shivering in the barns, of the gnawing worry that the winter had only just begun. Their solutions were always the same: more wood, a bigger fire, another layer of daubing. They fought the cold with brute force, throwing resources at it as if it were a wall to be battered down. But the cold was not a wall. It was a river, and it simply flowed around their efforts, relentless and unimpressed. They were all trapped in the same cycle of desperate labor and diminishing returns. Ilara's late husband, Arthur, had not been a plainsman. He had been an engineer from the old country, a man from a land of high, cold mountains where winter was not a season, but a permanent resident of the peaks. He had been a quiet man, a man of books and diagrams, of principles and calculations. He had died of a fever the summer before, leaving Ilara with 2 children, a half-finished cabin, and a collection of leather-bound notebooks filled with his precise, elegant handwriting and intricate drawings. In the settlement, he had been seen as a dreamer, a man whose head was filled with strange ideas that had little to do with the practical business of plowing a field or felling a tree. One night, as the wind shrieked and the cabin groaned under its assault, Ilara could not bear the sound of Lily's wheezing any longer. Desperate for a distraction, for any sliver of hope, she unlatched the heavy wooden chest where she kept Arthur's belongings. The scent of old paper and leather filled the cold air. She pulled out a thick notebook, its cover embossed with the words, "Principles of Thermal Dynamics." She didn't understand the complex equations, but she could understand the drawings. They showed buildings from his homeland, structures designed to survive winters far more brutal than this one. and one drawing in particular caught her eye. It was a cross-section of a house, and it had a strange feature she had never seen before. It had two roofs. The idea was simple in its form, but profound in its implications. There was a normal, pitched outer roof, designed to shed snow and rain. But beneath it, separated by a wide gap of air, was a second, nearly flat, heavily insulated inner ceiling. Arthur's notes, written in the margins, were clear. "The enemy is not the cold," he had written. "It is heat loss. We cannot defeat the cold. We can only protect the warmth." The space between the two roofs, he explained, would trap a massive pocket of still air. This trapped air would become the true barrier. It would not fight the cold, it would simply refuse to transmit the warmth out of the house. The heat from a small, steady fire would rise, be held by the insulated inner ceiling, and remain within the living space, a gentle, ambient warmth, instead of rushing upwards to be stolen by the frozen sky. The next day, she took a burnt stick and drew the design in the dirt outside the small general store. Silas, the settlement's most respected builder, was the first to see it. He was a large man, with hands like weathered slabs of oak, and a confidence born from a lifetime of building things that stood up. He had built half the cabins in the settlement, including her own, using the methods his father had taught him. He squinted at the drawing, his brow furrowed. "What is this foolishness, Ellada?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She explained the principle as best she could, her voice quiet but steady. She spoke of the pocket of air, the insulated inner ceiling, the way it would hold the heat. Silas listened for a moment, then threw his head back and laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was a deep, booming sound that drew the attention of the other men gathered nearby. "A roof on a roof?" he scoffed, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You want to build 2 roofs? We barely have the time and lumber to build one good one. The snow load alone would crush such a thing. It's a waste of wood, a waste of time." Another man, a farmer named Jeb, chimed in. "My grandfather built his cabin with a single roof. My father built his the same. It was good enough for them." He kicked at her drawing, smudging the lines in the dirt. "This is book nonsense, not for the real world." The other men nodded in agreement, their faces a mixture of pity and scorn. They saw a grieving widow, her mind addled by sorrow and foolish ideas from a dead husband who had never truly understood their way of life. They offered her advice, not on building, but on practicality. "Just chop more wood, Ilara," one said. "Keep the fire hot, that's the only way." They turned their backs on her and her drawing, dismissing the idea as the fantasy of a woman who did not understand the harsh realities they faced every day. Their laughter followed her as she walked away, a cold, sharp sound that bit harder than the wind. But their mockery did not extinguish the spark of hope that Arthur's notebook had ignited. It only hardened it into resolve. They saw foolishness. She saw a lifeline. They saw a waste of wood. She saw the conservation of heat, of life. That afternoon, she began her work. She would not try to modify her existing cabin. It was too flawed, its foundation already settled. Instead, she would build a small, new structure adjacent to it, a single, perfectly designed room that would serve as their winter sanctuary. She chose a spot on the south side of her cabin, sheltered from the worst of the north wind. The work was brutal. Her hands, unaccustomed to such labor, were quickly blistered and raw. The frosted ground resisted her shovel, each spadeful a small, hard-won victory. But she worked with a methodical patience that bordered on obsession. She was not just building a structure, she was building an argument. Every log she shaped, every joint she sealed, was a sentence in her rebuttal to their scorn. She began by felling smaller pines from the woodlot behind her property, trees the men usually ignored in favor of the larger oaks. They were easier for her to manage alone, and Arthur's notes specified that the type of wood was less important than the precision of the construction. She spent the first week just preparing the timber. Using her late husband's saw and axe, she stripped the bark and squared the logs. Her movements were clumsy at first, but a rhythm soon developed. The sharp scent of pine filled the air, a clean, medicinal smell that seemed to cut through the damp cold. While she worked, she could see the other settlers going about their winter preparations in the usual way. They stacked massive cords of wood against their cabins, patched their walls with fresh mud and straw, and cleaned their chimneys. They worked with a hurried, almost frantic energy, a stark contrast to her own slow, deliberate pace. They were reinforcing their failing defenses, while she was building a new kind of fortress altogether. Sometimes Silas would walk by, shaking his head with a look of profound pity. He saw her small, seemingly flimsy structure taking shape, and saw only confirmation of his judgment. He was in the process of adding a new wing to his own large cabin, using the thickest, most impressive logs he could find. His work was a display of strength, a testament to the traditional way. His axe fell with thunderous, confident blows. Her work was quiet, precise, and, in his eyes, hopelessly misguided. He saw her weaving mats of dried cattails and river grass, and he scoffed. He saw her mixing a thick slurry of clay and moss, and he shook his head. He did not see insulation. He saw flimsy filler, a poor woman's substitute for solid oak. The core of her design, the part they could not understand, was the inner ceiling. After laying the floor and raising the 4 short walls, she did not immediately begin on the roof. Instead, she constructed a framework for the interior ceiling, just 7 feet from the floor. On top of this framework, she laid a bed of tightly fitted planks. Then came the part that had earned her so much ridicule. She spent days gathering materials, sacks of dried moss from the creek bed, armloads of prairie grass she scythed from the frozen fields, bucket after bucket of thick clay from the riverbank. She mixed these ingredients into a dense, heavy plaster and laid it a foot thick over the planks of her inner ceiling. It was a slow, messy, back-breaking process. On top of this thick layer of insulation, she placed another layer of planks. She had created a massive, insulated barrier between the living space and the attic that would soon exist above it. Only then did she begin constructing the outer roof. It was a simple, pitched structure, just like any other, but its purpose was different. It was not there to keep the warmth in, it was there only to keep the weather out. It was a shell, a shield. The real work of protecting her family would be done by the mundane, ugly layer of mud and moss, and the pocket of still, unmoving air trapped between the 2 layers. The men of the settlement saw a woman building a flimsy shack with a ridiculously thick ceiling. They did not see the elegant principle at play. They did not see the trap she was setting for the warmth. As the first heavy snows began to fall, she was still working. The community saw her toil as a sad, desperate folly. They had finished their preparations weeks ago. Their wood was stacked, their walls were sealed as best they could be, and they were settled in for the long winter. They watched her with a kind of morbid curiosity, waiting for her strange little building to fail. They waited for the thick, heavy ceiling to collapse, for the first blizzard to tear the double roof apart. But it stood. It was small, unassuming, and to their eyes, deeply wrong. But it stood. By the time the real cold of deep winter arrived, she was finished. She moved her children's small beds into the new room, along with a small, efficient cast-iron stove Arthur had ordered from a catalog, a stove the other settlers had deemed too small to heat a proper cabin. With a deep breath, she closed the thick, insulated door, lit a small fire, and waited. The great storm arrived not with a whisper, but with a roar. It came from the north, a solid wall of white that devoured the horizon and swallowed the sun. The settlers called it a white hurricane, and it was a force of nature that defied all reason. The wind did not howl, it screamed, a high, thin, terrifying sound like tearing metal. The temperature plummeted, dropping 30 degrees in a single hour, then another 20. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, driven by the wind with the force of sand-blasted ice. It was a storm that erased the world, burying fences, roads, and even the smaller outbuildings in a seamless, churning sea of white. Inside the traditional cabins, the assault was immediate and overwhelming. The wind hammered against the log walls, forcing jets of fine, powdery snow through impossibly small cracks. The sound was deafening, a constant, violent shuddering that made the very timbers of the houses groan in protest. The roaring fires in the massive hearths, which had seemed so powerful just a day before, were now rendered almost useless. The storm was a giant bellows, sucking the heat up the chimneys with a greedy, insatiable thirst. Families huddled together, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their backs freezing while their faces were scorched by the fire. In Silas's large, well-built cabin, the situation was dire. He had built it himself, with the thickest logs and the tightest joints. It was the pride of the settlement, a symbol of his skill and his adherence to the proven ways. But the proven ways were failing. The wind slammed against the north wall like a battering ram, and the logs, frozen solid, seemed to shrink, opening up a dozen new cracks for the cold to invade. His wife and 3 children were huddled near the hearth, their faces etched with fear. The fire was a furnace, consuming logs at an alarming rate, yet the far corners of the room were already thick with frost. Silas stood by the fire, feeding it constantly, his own body a shield for his family. He could feel the cold seeping through the floor, through the walls, a relentless, invading army. He had built his house to be strong, but he had built it to fight the wrong enemy. He had built it to withstand weight and force, not an all-pervading, heat-stealing cold. As the first day of the storm bled into a night of absolute blackness and screaming wind, the situation in the settlement grew desperate. The constant, high-pitched shriek of the wind was a torment, wearing down nerves and erasing all hope. The cabins, once symbols of sanctuary, became frozen traps. Woodpiles, meant to last for weeks, were shrinking with terrifying speed. In one cabin, a family's chimney, clogged with wind-driven snow, began to fill the room with smoke, forcing them to open a window and let the full fury of the blizzard inside. In another, a section of the north wall, weakened by the constant vibration of the wind, began to give way, the daubing between the logs cracking and falling to the floor like dust. The methods passed down through generations were being tested, and they were breaking. The wisdom of the fathers, the traditions of the frontier, were no match for the fury of the sky. Now, shift your focus. Turn away from the groaning timbers and the roaring, desperate fires. Look instead to the small, strange structure leaning against Ilara's main cabin. From the outside, it was almost invisible, a low mound buried in a deep drift of snow. The wind, instead of hammering against a flat wall, flowed smoothly over the curved drift, its force blunted and redirected. There was no shuddering, no groaning of wood. There was only the muffled, distant sound of the storm, a beast raging somewhere far away. The single small chimney pipe extending from the roof puffed out only a thin, lazy wisp of smoke, a stark contrast to the frantic, billowing clouds belching from the chimneys of the other cabins. Inside that small room, there was a profound and startling quiet. The scream of the wind was a dull, low hum, a background noise no more threatening than a distant river. The air was not hot, not stuffy, but filled with a steady, even warmth that reached into every corner. Elara sat in a simple wooden chair, mending a tear in her son's trousers. Thomas and Lily were not huddled by the stove. They were on a blanket in the middle of the floor, playing quietly with a set of carved wooden animals. Their coughing had stopped. Their breathing was deep and even. They were warm. The small stove glowed with a gentle, ruddy heat, its belly filled with just a few small logs. The incredible, world-ending blizzard, raging just inches away, felt like a story being told, not a reality being lived. The insulated ceiling, the pocket of dead air, the carefully sealed walls, Arthur's principles were working. They were holding the warmth in a gentle, firm embrace, and the storm could only rage against the outer shell, impotent and locked out. The first day of the storm became 2, then 3. The relentless wind never paused, and the snow continued to fall. For the rest of the settlement, these days were a blur of fear and misery. For Elara and her children, they were quiet days of peace. She read to them from one of Arthur's books of stories. They ate their simple meals of stew and bread in calm comfort. She had to add a few small logs to the stove only 3 or 4 times a day. Her woodpile, which the other men had called laughably small, was barely diminished. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply ignoring it. Her small room was an island of calm in a sea of chaos, a pocket of defiance against the overwhelming power of the winter. It was a triumph not of force, but of intelligence. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind finally began to subside. The screaming howl dropped to a mournful moan, and then, at last, to a dead, echoing silence. The world outside was transformed, a landscape of impossible, sculptural white. Drifts rose to the rooftops of the cabins, burying the world in a soft, cold blanket. Inside Silas's house, the ordeal was over, but the damage was done. They had burned through nearly a month's supply of wood. A fine layer of snow covered everything in the room. His youngest child had a fever, and his wife's face was pale with exhaustion. His pride, like his woodpile, was gone, replaced by a cold, hard knot of fear. He knew they would not survive another storm like that. He bundled himself in his heaviest coat and pushed his way out the door, the snow collapsing into the room. He needed to check on his livestock and then begin the back-breaking work of digging out. As he struggled through a drift that was level with his shoulders, he glanced towards Elara's cabin. He saw the thin wisp of smoke rising from the chimney pipe of her strange little addition. But what truly caught his attention was what he didn't see. He didn't see frantic activity. He didn't see a door blocked by a mountain of snow. He didn't see any sign of the desperate struggle that his own family had just endured. A terrible thought struck him. With such a small structure, and a woman alone with 2 children, perhaps they hadn't survived at all. Perhaps that thin smoke was just the last embers of a fire that had gone out days ago. Driven by a sudden, guilty fear, he fought his way across the short distance between their properties. He reached her door and saw no footprints, no sign of life. He hammered on the thick wood with his fist. "Elara!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Are you all right in there?" He waited, his heart pounding. For a moment, there was no reply. Then he heard the sound of a bar being lifted, and the door swung inward. The first thing that hit him was the warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a roaring fire. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth, like a calm summer afternoon. It flowed out of the doorway and wrapped around him, a physical presence that was so profoundly different from the biting cold of his own home that it made him gasp. The second thing he saw was Ilara. She was not haggard or fearful. She looked calm, rested. Her children were sitting at a small table, eating porridge. There was no snow in the room. There was no frost on the walls. There was only a quiet, peaceful, impossible warmth. Silas stared, his mind unable to process the scene. He looked at the tiny stove, which was barely glowing. He looked at the small, neat pile of wood beside it, a pile that should have been gone in the first few hours of the storm. He looked at the children, their cheeks rosy and healthy. He looked back at Ilara, and his jaw worked silently for a moment before he could speak. "How?" he finally managed to ask, his voice a choked whisper. "How is this possible?" Ilara did not gloat. There was no hint of "I told you so" in her eyes. She simply stepped back and held the door open wider. "Come in, Silas," she said, her voice soft. "You look frozen." He stumbled inside, bringing a swirl of cold air with him, and for the first time in 4 days, he felt the muscles in his shoulders begin to unclench. He stood in the center of the small room, turning in a slow circle, a look of utter disbelief on his face. He reached out and touched a wall. It was not just free of frost. It felt neutral, almost warm to the touch. He looked up at the low, plain ceiling, the source of all his mockery, and he finally understood. He was wrong. He had been completely, utterly, and profoundly wrong. He had laughed at her. He had called her a fool. He had trusted in the strength of his arms and the traditions of his father, and they had failed him. She had trusted in the quiet diagrams in a dead man's book, and she had created a sanctuary. The contrast between her quiet success and his own desperate, exhausting failure was a physical blow. It humbled him in a way no storm ever could. He sank onto a small stool she offered him, the warmth seeping into his bones, and felt the sting of shameful tears in his eyes. Word of what Silas had seen spread through the settlement with the speed of a spring thaw. At first, it was just a rumor, a story too strange to be believed. But curiosity, sharpened by the memory of their own recent suffering, was a powerful motivator. That afternoon, Jeb, the farmer who had kicked her drawing in the dirt, came by, his face a mask of skeptical curiosity. He, too, was invited inside. He, too, stood in stunned silence, feeling the impossible warmth, seeing the healthy children and the tiny, efficient stove. He left without saying a word, his face pale with a dawning realization. Soon, a small trickle of visitors became a steady stream. Men and women, bundled in their heaviest coats, made their way to Ilara's cabin. They came to see the fool's house, the widow's folly. They would stand in the doorway, their mouths agape, as the calm, steady warmth washed over them. They would look at the thick, insulated ceiling, at the carefully sealed walls, at the small stack of firewood, and they would understand. Their derisive laughter was replaced by a heavy, respectful silence. They were witnessing the undeniable proof of a better way, and it rendered all their old certainties obsolete. Ilara met each visitor with the same quiet grace. She answered their questions simply and directly. She showed them the cross-section drawings in Arthur's notebook, pointing to the empty space between the roofs, explaining the principle of trapped air. She did not ask for apologies or praise. She simply shared the knowledge, offering it as a gift. She explained that the strength was not in the thickness of the logs, but in the intelligence of the design. The goal was not to generate more heat, but to lose less of it. It was a fundamental shift in thinking, a simple truth that had been hiding in plain sight. The most powerful moment came a week later. Silas returned, but not alone. He brought with him the other builders from the settlement, the men who had been his most enthusiastic chorus of mockery. They stood before Ilara, their hats in their hands, their eyes downcast. It was Silas who spoke, his voice stripped of its old, booming confidence. It was quiet, and it was humble. "Ilara," he began, finally meeting her eyes. "We were wrong, and you were right. What we built are just cold boxes for burning wood. What you have built, this is a home. Will you teach us?" And so she did. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, the men of the settlement would gather in her small, warm room. They would sit on the floor, their large frames crowded into the small space, and listen as she explained her husband's principles. She spread Arthur's notebooks on the table, and they leaned over the diagrams, their weathered faces lit by the glow of a single lantern. These were practical men who thought with their hands, and they asked practical questions. They traced the lines of the drawings with calloused fingers, asking about joints, about sealing, about the proper thickness for the insulation. She answered every question with patience, translating Arthur's complex theories into the simple language of wood and clay and labor. There was no mockery now, only a quiet, focused intensity. They were not just learning a new way to build, they were unlearning a lifetime of proud, mistaken tradition. When the long winter finally broke and the plains were reborn in the green fire of spring, a new sound filled the air of the settlement. It was not just the sound of birds and melting water, it was the sound of saws and hammers, a symphony of reconstruction. But they were not just repairing the damage from the great storm, they were rebuilding their world. Led by Silas, they began to systematically retrofit their cabins. They didn't tear them down. Instead, they opened up their roofs and built the second, inner ceiling, packing it with insulation, just as Ilara had shown them. The landscape of the settlement began to change. The work was slow and difficult, but it was driven by a new, shared understanding. The sight of a man on his roof was no longer a sign of a simple repair. It was a sign of conversion. The entire community was embracing the quiet wisdom they had once scorned. That summer, every single family built their own double roof, their own air trap. They started calling them Ilara's roofs, a name that stuck, spoken not with ridicule, but with a deep and abiding respect. The story of the settlement that survived the great storm did not stay confined to the banks of Willow Creek. Travelers, traders, and surveyors passing through that next winter were astonished. They would arrive in a blizzard, expecting to find settlers grimly hunkered down, only to be welcomed into cabins that were serenely warm, heated by small, efficient fires. They would ask how this was possible, and they would be told the story of the quiet widow and her husband's book. They would be shown the double roof, the simple principle that had changed everything. The idea spread. It traveled in letters to families back east, in conversations around campfires on the trail west. It was an idea perfectly suited to the frontier. It was effective, it used common materials, and it was born from a direct and desperate need. The knowledge passed from one homesteader to another, a quiet revolution of architecture. The story became a piece of frontier folklore, a lesson passed down. It was a tale not of a great hero who fought a monster, but of a quiet innovator who outsmarted an environment, a woman who listened to the wisdom of a book while others listened only to the echoes of their own pride. Years later, when the settlement had grown into a proper town, with a church and a school, Ilara would sometimes watch the children playing in the snow. Her own children, Thomas and Lily, were grown, with families of their own, living in warm, safe houses of their own making. The town no longer feared the winter. They prepared for it, they respected it, but they did not fear its power to break them. The memory of the great storm of '87 was now a story told to grandchildren, a tale of hardship overcome, a reminder of the time before they knew a better way. The most profound legacy was not in the changed rooftops, but in the changed mindset of the people. They had learned a lesson harder than any winter. They learned that the old ways are not always the best ways, and that strength is not always the answer. They learned that wisdom can come from the quietest voice, from the most unexpected source. And they learned that true community is not found in shared assumptions, but in the humility to admit when you are wrong, and the grace to learn from one another. The cold still came to the plains, as it always would, but it no longer found a people huddled in fear. It found a town that had learned to protect its warmth, a community that had been taught by a quiet woman with a drawing in the dirt that the most powerful tool for survival was not a stronger axe, but a better idea.